Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Last Man on Earth, the first 6 episodes. So, when going into this show, I feel like this show to me feels like they are throwing caution to the wind as far as a budget for the show goes. Like, man, you could just see the consistent, just elaborate, just seemingly like consistent time where Phil is ultimately taking throughout these 6 episodes to just showcase like how much money this show has. Really to the point of him making a joke of how expensive things are and so on and so forth. Of really just how we have high valued like items that Phil is finding and ultimately he is mentioning like, yep, this is a $6,000 thing that I'm drinking right now. I'm just gonna put cheese whip into it and just have a good time. We ultimately have it to where Phil is overly experimenting, and every single episode you can just feel like this show is just a gigantic, just funneling of money with every single episode that goes along. We ultimately have it to where Phil ultimately has a lot of experiments going on. Ultimately, seeing what he can do with bowling items, and then eventually it like escalates into obscurity of how many things that he can do with just targeting items into being just thrusted into another item, and oh wow, this is exciting. We have it to where Phil is to just ultimately just go in and just be like, nah, like let's see what I can just get away with today for every episode. Eventually we get to a point where Phil is the last man on Earth, question mark? Because when looking at it, it seems that eventually we seem to get other people that appear eventually. And when we have those people appear, it seems that Phil is to ultimately, I think, really want to rely on people and justifiably be a part of their like existence and stuff like that. Ultimately, you could have had it to where Phil just ultimately just goes like, nah, like I'm just gonna go and leave and just never come back kind of thing. But I think Phil ultimately realizes that he needs people to stay sane. He needs to be able to be with people now that he has them, or otherwise he would just go ape crap crazy. Because I think he is a people person. Because when even going into the pilot, we had it to where Phil is desperately just driving around, hoping that there's people along that way. And I just thought it was hilarious the numerous things that Phil would go out of his way to do when going into any number of these situations to ultimately desperately call out to any number of people to go and desperately want to be a part of society or whatever society's left at this point. Seemingly, bizarrely, it seems that this place had been wiped out by some virus of sorts, and so ultimately I'm like, oh, okay, well, eventually that is to happen at some point. Eventually, everyone is to get sick eventually, and so ultimately you have some people that had never gotten any kind of illness or whatever, so ultimately they ended up surviving after all this. So, going into this show, I think the thing that actually just sells this is just curiosity. Curiosity of what is to be provided within the show. Uh, this show has a very odd sense of humor to the point of where like Phil is to ultimately almost pull like an I Am Legend kind of thing, where ultimately we have it to where Phil is to almost hit on a girl that is a mannequin at points in time. Because ultimately Phil is just naturally assuming that he's the only one left on Earth, and so ultimately he has to fill his time with otherwise just either watching movies or otherwise going to some establishment where ultimately he is to meet what his equivalent of friends are. And so ultimately, we have it to where Phil is eventually, I think, going into a life that ultimately I think is filled with a lot of regret. Uh, Even when he actually does maybe quite possibly find people, he is still living in a life where he may not fully and fledgedly be enjoying it, which I'm ultimately just like, when looking at it, I'm like, well, why not just like, if you're gonna be on your own and you can be on your own, and there is no laws, uh, there is no like you can do anything and get away with it kind of thing. Why not just ultimately just like you can do whatever? Like if anything is causing you misery, then don't live in that misery. Just ultimately just go like, well, I can move a million miles away from wherever whatever is giving me a problem, and so to me, I just don't quite understand a lot of the episodes where people have grievances and want Phil to do something about certain things, and Phil ultimately does do them. It's like, well, why? Justifiably, if you don't like your circumstances in certain locations, just move to another location. Just really move to another location. Why go the extra effort of completely and utterly putting together certain things and cleaning certain things when you can just move to yet another location? So, speaking of which, let's move into the location of spoilers. Excuse me. Let's break out that double five to otherwise talk about The Last Man on Earth and talk about it in spoiler terms, because really it's just a lot of like putzing around through a lot of these 6 episodes, really. But eventually, we do get Will to eventually just experiment and ultimately just go into um, getting into a relationship, and that relationship becomes easily and quickly strained, as well as seemingly everything else that Phil is ultimately put up with just becomes heavily strained at a lot of points. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this show. So immediately this show opens. Excuse me. Immediately, this show opens with Phil ultimately going and seemingly driving a like I would call it like a RV or a like tour bus or some like extravagant like bus thing that has an intercom. Ultimately, driving around, ultimately asking like, "Hey, is anybody still alive?" Like I live in Tucson. He's ultimately trying to like say hello in many different languages. He's saying hello in French, bonjour, and all these other all these other intro hello phrases. He ultimately says like Chinese hello because he ultimately doesn't evidently know konnichiwa or any kind of phrase to say hello in other languages. So he says Chinese hello. So we have it to her, and I know that's probably Japanese hello, but anyways. We ultimately have it to where Phil is desperately going in and just driving around ultimately from every entry and exit sign of some state saying there's alive in Tucson. So we ultimately have it to where Phil is to drive around just from state to state and put in through signs that ultimately there's an alive person in Tucson. So we end up having it to where Phil is ultimately just he has a home where there's just a bunch of garbage just lying everywhere. But then there's also like tons and tons of money that seems to have just been thrown away in this location of Phil's home. Like to the point to where he's just scavenged for all kinds of things that ultimately would seem really, really expensive to just be put into this house and just chucked everywhere. We have it to where Phil has like tons and tons of paintings that are probably expensive that are just chucked all over the floor. We end up having it to where Phil at one point has a bathroom where there's just cans and cans and cans upon soda, and we have it to where Phil has seemingly jugs and jugs of water and so on and so forth, to where the point where ultimately every single time that Phil has to get to the bathroom, it's kind of like an obstacle course to kind of jump through all of these hoops, literally, or not literally, figuratively, to get to his toilet, which is hilarious. Uh, we eventually have Phil just get as drunk as humanly possible because who really cares? Like, ultimately, he's realizing that his life is to basically be squandered to be by himself. And so, ultimately, he is just depressed about that. We ultimately have it to where at some point Phil is shouting out to God to ultimately give him somebody to help him, to give him a girlfriend. And ultimately, we have it to where to where it seems that Phil is being rejected by God, and so ultimately, like Phil is like, "Well, I'll just do it myself," kind of thing. So we have it to where Phil is ultimately just taking expensive items because he can. There seems to be one scene where he just goes right into a grocery store and just starts like piling on stuff, just whatever. And then ultimately he takes like the entire like adult magazine section and just grabs the entire section and tosses that all into his cart because he's by himself. Uh, so we end up having it to where Phil is just ultimately just doing whatever he wants. He is ultimately going and like at some point he like drives inside a grocery store, just rams right through it because he doesn't care. Uh, we have it to where ultimately Phil ultimately goes and at first he goes and plays bowling outside of a bowling alley. He stacks the pins, he throws the bowling ball, but then he realizes, you know what, that's not quite fun enough. So ultimately we have it to where Phil like extends this like bowling ball attempt more and more and more to utter absurdity, to where Phil ends up taking like a ton of fish tanks, uh, and ultimately he ends up uh, throwing a ton of bowling balls right at these fish tanks, because we have it to where ultimately what ends up happening is Phil drives his truck as fast as he can in reverse to where the bowling balls end up coming flying out of his truck to ultimately fling and hit all of the fish tanks, and whatever doesn't hit, ultimately Phil ends up going and chucking the whatever bowling ball at whatever fish tank goes, to eventually to where ultimately Phil ends up just going and uh, taking a uh, taking a car on an incline like parking lot thing, and Phil ends up going and rolling the car to where it hits a oncoming car and crashes in between these two cars, and ultimately Phil is just so happy about that. So we ultimately have it to where Phil is to ultimately go and see a mannequin, and it seems that Phil is ultimately going and looking at this mannequin, and he's like, you know what, I think she might be my girlfriend. And so we have it to where Phil ultimately just what he does is he ends up shooting like if he goes into a grocery store, he ends up just taking and shooting the door and then opening it. And to where ultimately when he wants to get this mannequin, he just shoots the window and breaks the window and then just walks right into where the mannequin is and just starts talking to her. Heaven forbid he walks back out of this store with glass all over the ground or whatever. It doesn't matter. So we also end up having Phil, I guess, wanting to try to get some pointers about being all alone. And so we have it to where Phil is watching the Tom Hanks movie Castaway, which ultimately is a joke that comes in here later that I think is freaking hilarious. Because ultimately Tom Hanks becomes a another thing to talk about at some point. So we have it to where Phil is ultimately going and watching Castaway, not the entire thing, just a little bit, and we have it to where Phil mentions is like, hey, there's no way I'm ever gonna talk to a volleyball. It's like, if anything, balls are for fun. They're not for talking. I'm never gonna go that crazy. And so ultimately we have it to where Phil ultimately takes a giant amount of like racquetball balls and just flings them all over his house and then tries to hit as many as he can, because that's or like it's a squash ball or racquetball. Like I want to say it's like squash balls. He like tosses them all over his house and then tries to hit him with his racket. Um, that's another thing he does. But we ultimately have it to where Phil ultimately goes to a bar and starts talking to a bunch of his friends that are a volleyball, soccer ball, football, tennis ball, and so on and so forth. And we have it to where Phil eventually like takes these balls around with him to talk to them a lot, because reasonably he has nothing better to do with his time. We ultimately eventually have it to where Phil makes babies for these balls, and ultimately they are ending up being chewed things of gum. And so he ultimately calls them, yeah, I made babies for you. So we end up having it to where eventually we'll get to the point where Phil is going to meet another person and or people. So we end up having Phil eventually experimenting, and then ultimately he ends up realizing that he's like, you know what? Like I think that this is like I think I'm done. Like I think I'm just going to just try to figure out how to end myself in some way because there's nothing to do but just be alone. And so we end up having it to where Phil ultimately, in the Castaway like manner, takes a rock and chisels uh, R.I.P. Phil and so on and so forth. And so he ends up going and uh, doing like a ceremony of sorts, and ultimately like saying like, "Yeah, guys, I think this is the end." And then all of a sudden he sees a smoke signal, and he's like, "Oh my God, there is another person!" And so we end up having it to where Phil makes his way to a girl named Carol. So we end up having Phil going and finding a seemingly person that has been camping, and Phil eventually finds a bra and grabs the bra and sniffs it, and I would assess that Phil probably passes out of sorts from probably over drinking or any number of things. And eventually we have it to where seemingly Phil is daydreaming about this drop dead gorgeous woman that ultimately is making out with him. But then ultimately he realizes that ultimately he is getting CPR instead. And so Phil wakes up getting CPR from Carol. And so we have it to where Carol, played by Kristen, ultimately is to probably be the woman that Phil did not think that he was going to be getting out of this, but when looking at it, he probably assesses that Carol is probably going to be the last woman on Earth. So we end up having it seemingly where Carol ultimately mentions to Phil that, yeah, I saw your sign and I was making my way through here, and like I really couldn't figure out like where you actually were. Like you should have actually given your address of where you exactly were, so ultimately people could find you easier when you would make these signs. And ultimately Phil was like, yeah, I didn't think of that. So, because we end up having so many people who end up kind of driving by, luckily, and finding Phil through this. So, we end up having it to where Phil and Carol ultimately end up just deciding to make this relationship work. Ultimately, it seems that Phil ends up telling Carol his ex-girlfriend, which was the mannequin, and so Carol ends up beating up the mannequin and tearing her apart. And ultimately, Carol is like, well, yeah, it's good that I met your ex-girlfriend kind of thing. So we end up having it to where Phil and Carol are ultimately to forcibly end up getting married because they're the last two. Because ultimately we have it to where Carol is a very traditional woman, and she's like, well, I'm going to save myself for marriage kind of thing. And we have it to where, like, Phil's like, we're the only ones left alive. Who's going to do the ceremony kind of thing? And so we end up having it to where Phil is ultimately just wearing, like, a t-shirt, hoodie, and shorts to this wedding. We end up having Carol wearing like a wedding dress to the nine, and there's ultimately like a ceremony that bizarrely Carol had taped herself, and so we have it to where ultimately Phil is doing this wedding with Carol, and ultimately he is just kind of very hesitant about really going through all this, but he's like, "Nah, dude, I do, sure." So we end up having it to a reasonably like Phil's only job was to get the wedding rings, and of course he didn't get the wedding rings. He ultimately had said that he had gotten them, but he had lied about it because it's ultimately just like, dude, who cares? Who cares if we're married or not? We're the last two people. Why do we have to go through a marriage when ultimately like who's gonna care? It's like we're basically like nothing really matters because that's a hilarious thing. We have it to where eventually uh, Carol and Phil end up going to the grocery store, and I thought that this was the funniest thing. So we end up having it to where Phil ends up parking in the handicap spot, and Carol is like, "Oh my God, why are you parking in the handicap spot? There might be a handicapped person that ends up coming their way here and seeing that that spot is taken, and how could you do that?" And Phil is like, "We're the last two people alive. If there's a handicapped person, that handicapped person can park wherever the heck that they want. If anything, there's even a much more convenient location to park, and that is right in front of the store." And we have it to where Phil just ends up driving all the way through the store, and we have it to where Carol ultimately tells him, it's like, well, this is honestly a really bad place to park. And Phil is like, fine, I will not park here then. And so Phil just ends up parking wherever, and then they just walk up to the store, and we have it to where Phil and Carol just get whatever and then leave. So, so we have it to where ultimately, we have it to where in here that we have Phil, Carol, and they're both in wedded bliss. It seems that ultimately they are getting it on, or what would be the equivalent of getting it on, because ultimately it seems like there is no actual thrusting motions to be done. It seems like Carol is talking quasi dirty of sorts, and Phil is saying absolutely nothing. And so we have it to where we have it to where Melissa comes along. We have it. We have to where Melissa ends up just kind of driving by and ends up finding people, and so now we have it to where Phil is seeing the woman of his dreams, and ultimately he is stuck with Carol, and so we have it to where Phil is to go and to ultimately ask Marissa, like, like how is she doing kind of things. Like we have it to where Phil is trying to spend as much time with Melissa as humanly possible because he actually likes her. It seems that Phil has to forcibly build an entire door for Carol. Um, because ultimately we also have it to where Carol needs to desperately garden as well, and so Phil ends up rigging together a water system that will ultimately work for Carol, so that way she can water her plants, which ultimately looks hilarious. So, so ultimately, Carol talks about all the stuff that she's planted and everything like that, and so Phil ultimately has to reconstruct a door for Carol, which looking at the door, like the door just becomes this giant wall that Phil has to basically pull off of the house to get inside Carol's home. So it makes rationally no sense to have that door there. Anyways, we have a tour. Eventually, Carol ends up just going and putting a seemingly like these giant like white curtains over her wall as a door, and Carol complains to Phil about like, yeah, great thing that you did with my door. Cause it's like, yeah, like why would you want to do that every single time? Anyways, so we end up having it to where eventually Melissa is to come to the fray, and we have it to where Phil is ultimately fantasizing and having dreams about sleeping with Carol or sleeping with Melissa, and then he realizes that he's stuck with Carol. And so ultimately, we end up having it to where Phil and Carol had to talk about reproducing and repopulating. And so Phil otherwise decides to talk to Melissa, and Melissa is mentioning that she is horny. And so ultimately, we have it to where Phil is to go, okay, well, she needs to also be able to reproduce as well. So ultimately, we have it to where Phil is justifying to Melissa like how much that they need to be open minded and need change and need to and ultimately Melissa is ultimately talking about bringing children into the world. So we end up having Phil going and talking to Carol ultimately to mention to Melissa that ultimately there needs to be like multiple children in the world so that way they can all be able to continue to be able to reproduce because heaven forbid they have they have two different genders of children and ultimately have to uh, reproduce more than that to ultimately justify being having those children to reproduce, so on and so forth. So we have it to where Carol and Melissa end up uh, ultimately at first being at odds with one another because they find out about that Phil is ultimately trying to orchestrate him being able to sleep with women a lot more often. And we end up having Carol and Melissa end up going and being at odds with one another, but then Melissa ends up trying to bring champagne and ultimately try to make amends. So that way, ultimately, Carol and Melissa otherwise make a truce to say that Phil ultimately needs to uh, give them children. And so we have it to where Phil ultimately sleeps with Melissa only to be able to make a baby, and that's it. So Phil ends up going and trying to sleep with Melissa, but right as that is going to happen, we eventually have it to where there is another man that comes into the fray that ultimately is uh, where is he? Um, oh my god, he comes up really early into the show. Uh, Todd, Rodriguez, I believe. I could be wrong about that. Um, all right. Uh, yeah, Todd. So ultimately, we have it to where Todd ultimately is driving by, and again, like it would have been surefire enough, a very quick, like basically if Todd would have sneezed the wrong way, he probably wouldn't have noticed that there was fireworks going off. Because ultimately, Phil ultimately does all kinds of fireworks, or ultimately just we have it to where they play music or sound or whatever. To ultimately, there's always a reason for anyone to drive by and whatever, what have you. So we also ultimately find out that Phil ultimately has a pool bathroom. So we end up having it to where Phil ultimately cuts out of his diving board a hole in a portion of his diving board, and we have it to where Phil ends up going and dropping down and onto the diving board and basically pooping and peeing in on his diving board on his pool. And so we end up consistently having it to where ultimately Phil is taking a dump and somebody's walking in on him to have some conversation, and Phil's like, dude, I'm going to the bathroom, like leave me alone. To where eventually we forcibly have to have Phil at some point clean this pool, because ultimately the smell, of course, becomes very ripe, and people start to complain about it, to where ultimately we have Phil forcibly having to clean up his own pool. But then again, he could have just moved. Anyways, so we ended up having it to where Todd eventually, quickly but surely, ends up going and ends up really connecting with Melissa, and that rubs Phil the wrong way. Ultimately, it seems that Todd and Melissa ultimately connect with their favorite movie being Shawshank Redemption, and ultimately Phil has never seen this movie, but otherwise he ultimately mentions that he has. He's like, "Oh yeah, I remember that movie, that Shawshank, that Shank, that Shaw, you know." Man, I can't believe, like, I remember that film so vaguely, or so often, uh that ultimately, yeah, I remember Tom Hanks being in that film. Man, what a Tom Hanks movie that was. Oh my god. And Tom Hanks is not actually in that movie. We have a Tim Robbins, but not a Tom Hanks in that movie. So we end up having it to where Todd ultimately mentions the easiest quote that you can ever mention from Shawshank Redemption, which ultimately Morgan Freeman goes into saying, "It you get busy living or you get busy dying." That ultimately is pretty much the only quotable quote that you could ultimately say is from Shawshank Redemption, like as if somebody lazily just ultimately just goes like, "Yeah, there's no other quote besides that one, so you might as well just say the one that anybody would know. So just say that one." That felt like the laziest way of approaching things. But eventually we have it to where Phil ultimately goes and says some quote that ultimately makes no sense to Melissa afterwards, to prove that it seems that he really hasn't seen a lick of that movie still, because ultimately he steals all the information off of the internet or IMDb and doesn't actually watch the film and say that he likes it or not. So we end up having it to where Todd is ultimately really connecting with Melissa, to the point of eventually when Phil, Carol, Melissa, and Todd all go and play tennis, we ultimately have it to where Phil is telling Todd to take off his shirt, so that way they can be skins and the girls be shirts. And we end up finding out that Todd had some scar that ultimately he had given a organ to one of his family members that ultimately ended up dying. And so we end up having Todd ultimately kind of get blubbery and teary eyed about all that. So he ends up walking off to where Melissa goes and tries to comfort him, and then they kiss. So ultimately, we have it to where seemingly, no matter what Phil does, Todd is just going to be overwhelmingly overwhelmingly in interest of being with Melissa and vice versa. And so ultimately, there's nothing that Phil could really do at this point, but to just let this all happen. So we end up having it to where ultimately Todd and Marissa are going at it, and the entire time this is going on for like days now. We end up having it to where they're Todd and Melissa going at it, and they're playing the same song over and over and over. She drives me crazy, ho ho, like no one else. And so that song is going on over and over and over. And every single time that they do it, that is their song. That is their love making song. And so ultimately, we have it to where Phil is like, oh my god, could they please play anything but that song? Good God. And so eventually we have it to where Phil is talking to Todd and mentioning he's like, yeah, like I can't believe that me and Melissa are just going at it, and bizarrely like we're just ending up playing this song, and then I guess we didn't realize that ultimately this song was just going on repeat, like we didn't realize. But then ultimately, it's like that just became our song, so we just kept on playing it. And so Phil was like, yeah, and it's getting really annoying. Could you guys just play anything else? But, anyways, so we end up having Todd repetitiously hearing this song, and we eventually have it to where Carol is complaining about Phil's pool toilet. And so ultimately, we find out that ultimately Carol uh, has a hotel, an entire hotel, where ultimately she defecates in at some point, I guess. Like, so she goes to every hotel room and just defecates in every single one of the hotel rooms, I guess. Um, I guess to ultimately just have the smell not contract or whatever. So, because we eventually have it to where Phil is supposedly the president of the United States, and ultimately we have it to where Melissa and Todd are ultimately just like, well, why did we all of a sudden make him president? And ultimately, because it's like, well, Phil was the one to kind of get us all here and whatever, and so ultimately they're like, yeah, I don't know if we should really make him president or not. So because we ultimately have it to where Phil is ultimately try to make a grievance board where ultimately if somebody complains about anything that ultimately just put it on a board and they'll have a vote on it to try to like sway things. um, and funny enough, we eventually had it to where when Marissa and Carol were having problems with Phil, ultimately Phil had done a dunk tank, so ultimately Carol and Melissa would get their anger out on Phil to ultimately dunk him into the water. But funny enough, we kept having it to where Phil ultimately bizarrely end up kept dunking himself because the contraption kept breaking, and to where we had Phil consistently dunking himself to where it like repetitiously like just kept happening and it looked hilarious. But anyways, so we have it to where Phil is ultimately trying his best to ultimately try to get rid of Todd. Because ultimately he's figuring out that, like, well, like at first make Todd seem unattractive, and that's not working. And so ultimately we have it to where Phil ends up driving seemingly for 3 hours with Todd to ultimately just leave him out somewhere and get rid of him. And so Todd ends up going and like talking to Phil about like, oh, this must be your special thinking place that ultimately you like to go to. It's like, well, we've been driving for like 3 hours, and so on and so forth. So Phil ends up going and he's like, you know what? I think I hear something. Like I think I hear something with the problem with the tire, and so Todd goes out to check it, and so Phil ends up driving off, ultimately leaving Todd supposedly in the desert, the dust, the whatever, and Phil can't go with it. Like he's ultimately like going and driving in reverse, then driving back, then driving in reverse, then driving back. But then ultimately he ends up deciding to just pick up Todd and just drive home. Because ultimately, like, there's no way of him to just leave Todd by himself. And so ultimately we have it to where Phil confesses that he's like, you know what, this is just my thinking spot. And so Todd ultimately goes, wow, this is actually, when really looking at it, this is a great thinking spot. Like, we could have we could have stopped any like hundreds upon hundreds of miles to see the exact same views, but like I can see why this is your thinking spot. And Phil ultimately starts to drive off, but Todd is like, you know what? How about we just take a minute and just enjoy whatever this is? And so Phil ends up going, okay, sure. And so Todd actually takes a minute and he's like, meh, okay. So they drive off. So reasonably, with all the weird and or bizarre stuff that ends up going within these episodes, there's a lot of stuff that I kind of skipped around about. We ultimately have it to where like Phil ultimately has like a full on like Grizzly Adams beard and long hair and whatever. And eventually he ends up like shaving his entire beard and or mustache, but he still has the long hair. And I think it's kind of funny that ultimately when he shaves all that off, we have it to where Carol ultimately complains about him shaving it off. And so, like, there's nothing that Phil could really do to win anybody over, even though really he could have just left good enough alone and been by himself, and he would have probably been completely and utterly fine. So there is like not a lot going on in the show, but what is kind of going on is kind of funny and or weird. It's kind of like experimental stuff to just kind of see what you can do with if you had all the time in the world, and like what would you do, and so on and so forth. And eventually, if you were the last man or woman on Earth, like what would that be like? And so yeah, we really do have this show kind of really throwing caution to the wind and money to the wind as well. Because for how many things that I've seen him just completely annihilate and explode and destroy and whatever in these 6 episodes, like I'm kind of interested to just see how much more money that this show is willing to just burn. Because that's what it seems like to me. Like them doing fireworks and all kinds of other things and any number of stuff that ultimately seems odd and or weird to approach, this is what this show goes into. So at the end of the day, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this. Was ultimately is just a weird and or odd experiment to just kind of see what this show was. And I don't know, I just kept watching it afterwards. Like there isn't a lot going on, but what is going on is just people that I think are kind of funny in a lot of ways. So anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye everybody. Bye everybody.